Telling you, homie, that was the reason why
You've
I was
been
driving.
warned.
Yes, sir.
I was driving for the fun stuff.
That's what I'm talking about. Got a guest that's coming in. She was actually a guest on our show some months ago back in the older building. We're bringing her back on because I think she's got some stuff that we could really apply to our psyche, especially as of late. Douglas, go ahead and introduce, if you would, please. Sir.
Joining us once again on the show is Professor Corinna Lain, a leading scholar on constitutional law and the death penalty. She's the author of Secrets of the Killing State, The Untold Story of Lethal Injection, a powerful and deeply researched book that challenges how we think about capital punishment in America. Today, we'll dive into the emotional and eye-opening epilogue of her work, where law meets humanity in its rawest form. Professor Lain, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me back. I'm happy to be here.
Professor Lain, you mentioned that this project changed you in ways you didn't expect. Can you walk us through how your perspective evolved emotionally and morally while working on this book, especially during the epilogue?
Yeah. So, the book Secrets of the Killing State was based on 7 years of deep research into lethal injection. So, I'm studying executions. It's a dark walk. And so the book is all based on research, but at the end, I wrote this epilogue because the research changed me in some unexpected ways. And I just felt the real need to share it. I've been writing about the death penalty for around 2 decades, 18 years. And I've always viewed condemned prisoners as, these people who did, horrible, unspeakable things. And I want to own that. I want to, honor that and say, yeah, these are really bad things, probably, like, hopefully the legal system didn't get it wrong and they're not actually innocent, but that's a separate story. But, even people who did these horrible things, they still deserve protection of the law, arguably even more so. I'm a law professor, so I think a lot about that. But, I confess that I have kept my distance, my emotional distance from the humanity of these, faceless, convicted capital murderers that I've been studying all these years. And, this project offered a front row seat as to who these people are. Not who they were in their worst moment, not who they were at the time of, their crime or even the time of trial, but who are they when we are executing them, who they have become and who others are capable of becoming. Because I think in our mind's eye, we tend to freeze these people in a single moment of time.
Yes.
I myself have done so, but what I saw is that time works changes, and was really struck by that. So
on redemption and humanity, you described many condemned prisoners as people who found redemption. Some even became spiritual leaders. How should that really impact public opinion or policy around execution?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Time and time and time again, what I saw was, we're killing someone who killed, presumably, but who is no longer a killer. Mm-hmm. It's 10, 15, 17, 20, 30, 40 years after their crime. In fact, this month there'll be an execution. The guy has been on death row 49 years.
Golly.
49 years. That guy's he's not the same person. And I'm always reminded of this attorney for one of the executions. He said, in his statement, he said, there was no reason for the government to kill him. And the attorney went on to say, in any case, they failed. The Destin Honkin they wanted to kill is long gone. And that just sums it up. And in the epilogue, I talk about this guy. So to answer your question, I talk about this guy. It's a nice illustration. This guy named Brian Dorsey. And Brian Dorsey, he was convicted of this is this guy in Missouri. He was convicted of a double murder. Bad, any murder is terrible, but this is a double murder. It was a bad crime, of course. And it's 17 years later, and I'm in the midst of writing the epilogue, and I get these Google News alerts, and this op-ed came across my desk, and the title was, "We corrections officers know Brian Dorsey has changed. Governor Parser, don't execute him." And I was like, "Ooh, that's interesting. I'm going to read that," And this guy, Brian Dorsey, it was 17 years later, and he lived in the honor dorm of the prison.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know how a condemned capital murderer gets to the honor dorm.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how that happens, but he did. And he was the prison barber. And had been the prison barber for over a decade. And he cut the hair of not only all the other prisoners, but by choice, the other prison guards, including the 2 wardens.
Wow.
So like, imagine what that looked like. A condemned capital murderer with a pair of scissors and a razor blade at the warden's neck.
Yeah.
Right? Like time and time and time again. And, cutting over to the op-ed, the op-ed reads, Brian Dorsey is an excellent barber and a kind and respectful man. There isn't a nicer guy than Brian. And then they go on to say, and I'm going to quote from the op-ed here, "Taking Dorsey's life would be especially traumatizing for many current and former prison staff members, myself included, who have come to respect and care for this exemplary inmate." And, the governor didn't commute the sentence, and the prison guards who had come to know and respect this person then had to kill him. And, so it's not only in the epilogue, but, in the book I talk about, hey, listen, when you study executions, you get to see what this death penalty thing really is. And, because executions are where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like this, and I think when we debate the death penalty, when we talk about it as an idea. I'm for it or I'm against it, often on tribal lines. And studying executions, it's like, it's not just an idea. The government is, killing someone on purpose. And other people are filing into a room to watch. And someone has to do that work. So, there's another place where I'm talking, and I just quote people, I'm just telling the stories. All throughout the book, I'm just telling the stories. But, there's another place where one of the Department of Corrections directors says, and I'm just going to quote him, "In an execution, the condemned prisoner is a known human being who is totally defenseless when brought into the death chamber. Staff members know he's been secured safely for many years before his execution and poses no threat." And another one says, "You're working with a prisoner for 10 years. You've interacted with them every single day. You know they've changed. All of a sudden they flip a switch and now it's like, okay, we're going ahead and killing them. There has to be an underlying effect from that, without a doubt." And another one says, people think it would be so easy to go up and execute someone who committed such a heinous act. But the truth is, killing a human being is hard. You have to transform yourself into that person who will take a life. You can't tell me I can take a life of people and go home and be normal. So it's like, what I talk about in that epilogue is, we're killing someone who killed, presumably, but who is no longer a killer. But who are we creating when we ask someone else to kill as part of their job?
Yeah.
And I saw, again, I don't comment on it in the book. I just tell the stories. But the stories I tell are, about executioners patting the person on the shoulder, and, they're trying not to stick them too much. These people, some of them are really old. They get wheeled in a wheelchair.
Ugh.
They have to be propped up on a medical pillow because they don't want them to choke while they're killing them. Like Louisiana had 2 guys. This is like in the last couple months. 2 guys, they executed one. The other one was 81 years old, and he died like a week before he was supposed to be executed.
Wow.
And so it's like, that's what this really is.
Mm-hmm.
And, as to policy, I think the people sometimes stop and they say, well, they deserve it, so like we're done. And, I think the book and the research, the argument there is, well, that's just half the equation. Even if that's true, that's half the equation. The other half is, has the state done what it needs to do to deserve to take that life, right?
Yeah.
Like, even if you have undocumented, people in the country, you can't just throw them on a plane and, fly them out. Like, there's process, there's things. And so that's the book. But the other part of that, the inadvertent thing that I wasn't studying, but that I learned, was like, you think these people deserve it. Well, guess what? They're not the same person. They're really, really, really not. And, Douglas, you said, a lot of these people have started prison ministries. They've changed it. And, they're not all Christians. Sometimes, they go to their desk praying to Allah or Jehovah, oftentimes Jesus as they die. They sing hymns. I came across a case where they sang a hymn with the executioners.
Wow. What?
Before they had to kill him. Yeah.
A sing-along. In the death chamber.
I mean, but, but here's the thing that I think about is, like, I wonder, right now, the strongest death penalty support in the country is evangelicals. It's born-again Christians. And I sit there and think, I wonder if they knew, by the way, you're killing your Pauls.
Yeah.
We are killing our Pauls. We are literally killing our Pauls. We are killing, like, there was a guy, I think he just got executed. He was online this month to be executed. He started a prison church on death row. Like that, he literally started a church on death row. And there was a minister who came in and said, I have scarcely met someone more holy in my entire life.
Whoa. And
it's like, y'all, that's the guy we're killing. Like, that's the person. Did he do something terrible? Yes. Will he ever get out? Never. And so that sense, I just want to say, look, the state's taking their life. They're just, they'll never get out. So, like this other piece, though, he started not just a prison ministry, but a church, and he's changing other people's lives. And that's the guy we're killing. And, I wonder if people know that. And I wonder if, you look at these people and you're like, yeah, they did this terrible thing. And I look at it, and I am a person of faith, and say, that's a God special. That's like, God's like, I'm going to do something with you that when I'm done with you, they're going to know it is I. They're going to know, because the deeper the despair, the worse the person, the greater the testimony of who they've become.
Yeah.
So I think it has huge policy implications, religious implications.
Yes.
For people of faith. Yeah, that was a long answer, but
No.
Thanks for asking.
We had to let you cook, Jabari.
Yeah. So I want the word to get out,
Right. Professor Lain, I have a question. How much? I mean, when I'm listening to you, I definitely understand. And being the son of or the grandson of a Baptist minister, I definitely understand forgiveness. And I know there are a lot of people that seek forgiveness because they've known they've made, a very heinous choice, something that they can never really repair. How much pushback have you got when you've talked about that? Because I know a lot of people that say, you know what, they committed that crime, then it's a life for a life, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that kind of thing.
Professor
Are
Lain.
you still there?
Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
sorry about that. I
Yeah.
think I lost you, but I caught most of it.
Okay.
And the eye for an eye thing, and so one of the things that I wonder about is, okay, and look, I would love an answer to this. I'm truly asking, like, yeah, there's eye for an eye, but Jesus says in the New Testament, like, Jesus points to that. You have heard it said, but I tell you something different. And so there's lots of places in the Bible where it says one thing in one place and another thing in another place. And, you can find, it's famous for that, right? Like, you can
Right.
find the thing
Right.
that supports what you want. But this is one where Jesus literally points to that passage and says, that's not for you. That's not for you. And so one of the things I wonder is, like, okay, but why are the Christians, who are the Jesus followers, like, why is it that, like, you are completely not listening to this piece, pointing to the Old Testament when, Jesus made all things new, right? The blood has been shed. You who want blood, the blood has been shed. Do you not believe? Do you not believe in Jesus? I think I don't understand it. But you also asked about forgiveness, and I wanted to tell you a story about that. So this is one that was covered, I think, in the Atlantic, and the writers, she's so good, but it's about this guy named Jimmy Barber, and he got executed. But the victim, they take a long time. It's going to take time to get through the appeals. And she's hanging on. She's the victim's daughter, or maybe granddaughter. But, these victims, it's 10 years and they're waiting, and, appeals come and death warrants, and then they get stand down. And so when I think about the victims, and look, I'm a former prosecutor. I think about the victims. When I think about the victims, what I think is the death penalty is actually really bad for the victims because they are tethered to this person.
Oh, yeah.
For decades. Think about the family members of the guy who's been on death row for 49 years. Like, are they even alive anymore? But it's like, you want closure. It's the opposite of closure. Get ready. It is the opposite of closure, but by way of forgiveness. So she finally writes this, she writes him this letter. She'd never been in contact with him. This is the killer. She says, and I'm quoting her letter, "I'm tired, Jimmy. I'm tired of carrying this pain, hate, and rage in my heart. I can't do it anymore. I have to forgive you." He writes back, "Dear Sarah, receiving your letter was the most uplifting moment I have experienced, short of October 6, 2001, when I forced the county jail to baptize me for the remission of my sins into death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Sorry could never come close to what is in my heart and soul. The self-loathing, shame, shock, and disbelief of what I did almost overcame me. If not for God's grace, I would be gone." She writes back, "You have freed me. Receiving your letter was the final piece of freedom. The weight was lifted when I forgave you, but your response was the final freedom and release. I have no anger, zero. I feel as if 1,000 pounds was lifted from my soul. I'm sorry it took me so long to write." I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the victim's family member saying, I'm sorry it took me so long to write.
Yeah.
But, for me, I know, and the research shows, forgiveness is the only true closure. But, I also know, look, I haven't been through this, and forgiveness, even though that is true, it may be asking too much. Like, that's something you've got to come, that they have to come through their own heart, right? Like, you can't make someone do that. And so what I think of is like, yeah, it's got to be forgiveness, but that's on them. What we can do as a society is at least let them move on. And look, if you believe in redemption, you should have problems with life without parole too, because that's throwing away their life too. But as for where we are, vis-a-vis the death penalty, look, at the very least, if someone just got life without parole, and by the way, you save millions of dollars by doing that. But in any event, that's a different conversation too. But, if it's just life without parole, the person can still appeal, they can do whatever they want, but they're serving their sentence. They're getting their punishment. The victims get to move on. They're done. They get to start their own healing. When it's the death penalty, they haven't got their punishment yet. The punishment is the death penalty. So they're waiting. They're just waiting. They cannot move on yet. And so I feel like with this death penalty thing, it's like we say to them, yeah, you lost your family member tragically, but now we're going to take a couple decades of your life too. You don't know it yet, but that's what's in store. And I'm thinking about the El Paso shootings, the tragic killings in the Walmart. And, that guy got a bunch of life sentences. They pled it out. And part of the reason they pled it out is because the victims knew. They were smart. And they said, you know what? The death penalty is not no, we need healing. We need to move on. And, there was actually this amazing act of forgiveness that happened in the courtroom, where one of the victims, that all of the victims' family members, they had the chance to speak to the judge if they wanted, and some of them did. And one of them asked the judge, can I go hug him? And the judge was like, what? And the judge said, would that help you? And she said, yeah, it would. I know that this is really how I heal. And, and she did. And then there was another family member of another family that said, yeah, me too. And so, those people walked out with a different heart. But, even the victims who weren't in that space, they were done. It's like, okay, now let's start the healing process, right? Like, now let's act like that case is done. Now let's start. And, I can't help but say, because I do think about victims, we spend millions upon millions of dollars. Ohio just did a 2024 study and said, if we gave everyone life without parole that was charged with first-degree murder instead of the death penalty, we'd save somewhere between $100 million and $300 million. That's how much the death penalty costs extra. And I think of Florida. There was a study, and they were like, all right, this is how much it costs for the death penalty, because, you get 2 lawyers, and it's 2 trials in one.
Yes.
One is, and there's all these costs. We could talk about that. But then they were like, okay, how many executions did we get for spending all that money on the death penalty system? Okay, well, that's how much the process costs. Here's what the product was. Okay, how much was it per execution? $24 million per execution. And I just think, what could you do with $24 million? I'm on the road right now, and I'm talking. I'm talking to family members of victims, and one of the things that they're saying is, we've been in crisis. We're not thinking about like the death penalty. We're thinking, I need therapy. I need somebody to help me get up in the morning. I can't get out of bed. I'm so racked with depression. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my house. Who's going to pay for therapy? By the way, my kids need therapy. By the way, I need childcare so that I can go get my therapy. I need services. That's what I need. I need services. And there are none coming out of the state because we're spending our resources on this other thing. So
I think, Professor Lain, that you coming on today like this, you're speaking of transparency and fairness and having us take a good look at our own humanity. I just want to say, as we wrap up, Professor Lain, thank you for sharing your time, your insight, and your powerful reflections with us today. Your work, these decades of research, that's going to challenge us to see beyond the legal system, and it's going to make us confront the human stories behind the headlines. And we appreciate you returning to the show and continuing this important conversation.
Thank you so much. And, thank you for having me on.